Hey, what's up, viewer? Welcome back to this Nebulous live creation series. This is day 8, hour 3. I'm sorry that I'm slugging along here on day 8. Slowly but surely, though, I'm making the progress. Alright, so a quick word before I start. I was considering doing something where I start doing some work on the game off video, and perhaps once I make some strides, record it. I've just been getting this urge to simply focus on the game hard without doing any video recordings. So I'm debating whether or not to start doing that. For now, though, I'm going to stick with the recordings since they still are helping to keep me focused. But for future efforts, I may just start doing some work here or there on the game that I don't record, and then I'll probably just like post updates, progress updates and stuff like that. So that's something I'm considering. Alright, for now though, I'm going to get started on this video. So I'm at a point where I have a functional infrastructure system. There are a few things that need to happen, like if the player discovers a new celestial and selects it, the celestial does not, by default, have the ability to be invested with it. Excuse me. So I'm going to need to provide a way to claim claim the celestial and then be able to impart investments upon it. And part of that's the scanning system, which I've got to find it. The other step is going to be, I'm going to have to be able to create a ship and send a ship over. And the ship will have the capacity to actually claim the system. And then once not the system, but the celestial. Once the celestial is claimed, then these investment values can be placed on that planet as well, or a moon, or whatever it winds up being. Alright, I've also got the research system set up to run these 3 values. They aren't set up to do any ship stuff because I haven't made the ships yet, but they'll be able to be worked on just the same at that point. For now, though, these values are functional, and they actually work as they're supposed to. Outside of balancing them to some other extent, they are effectively operational, and there's even room to expand. Oh my god, excuse me, I don't know why the hell I'm yawning so much right now. Alright, so these work. The scanning system works. That puts me at a few crossroads. One thing I can do is set up the ship system. Or I can essentially start making the capacity to do ships, which is going to require some kind of design decision for what builds the ships. Do I have to build an orbital structure, or can I just start by building the ships from the planet and just launching them from the planet? Which doesn't require functionalizing orbital infrastructure, so that's one reason why I've considered that. And once the ship's up, that's actually a huge part of the game, is using ships in the game. So that's the one thing. The other thing would be, the other direction I can go is work on the spawning system for the Celestials, which would effectively generate more random Celestials. They would be randomly defined. There would be other random factors in the long run, like it'd be cool to make the sun a random type of sun. It would be nice to add different types of planets that could be spawned. However, that's getting into some design decisions where, like, do different planets do different stuff kind of thing. Like maybe certain planets have certain resources, or maybe they have different capacities. And so it's all like design decision stuff. And then after that, there's like the potential to have moons on planets, or moons around planets. So you could effectively have a scan target of the moon, and you can do all this stuff on the moon. The other major thing is getting into like subplanet celestials. So like the easy ones off the top of my head are like a asteroid cluster and a gas cluster. Those are essentially the only two I could really come up with. Maybe like they do something like a pirate base or something like that, but sorry, I'm yawning my ass off right now. I could do something like a pirate base, but like often those are like hidden clichely in an asteroid field or something. So like I'm just not quite sure exactly how to do the. I'm not exactly sure what to design into the different celestials. I understand that for the most part, there's like other planets, maybe moons around those planets. Beyond that, there's like even in a game like Stellaris, the anomaly systems are usually on something. So they're like the anomalies are on the moons, or they are on the planets or something. But like in a game like that, some of the economy is very simple. It just comes down to you build like a couple mining stations here or there, and you have some extra resources. It's starting to get into another part of the game, which is having more than just one resource type. So running the spawn system, I could build the spawn system, and I could start plugging in these white spheres, but I don't feel like that's the greatest thing in the long run. So while I'm at it, it wouldn't hurt to. It wouldn't hurt to add the system for smaller scan targets, which require higher frequencies to actually scan down. The other idea is to perhaps have like a kind of like in Sins of a Solar Empire, where you can like explore your planet. It would be cool to more or less add increasing difficulty of discovery on planets of things you can like discover, and you have to invest into those discoveries. And I suppose one way to do it would be to, on your planet, you can actually have some kind of infrastructure, and you could just run it up and see what it discovers. You could also like essentially put a scanning system on a ship, and you'd have an exploration ship that can scan the planet at a close range, which allows you to jack up the frequency and like massively decrease the range and the angle. So the idea would be that ships could in fact go to different places, and they could scan down these qualities on the signatures. Which is like in Star Trek, they send the ships to do stuff, to like scan the planets and make discoveries and stuff. So it makes some sense in that regard. The other option is the planet could, of course, do the scanning, and if its frequency, and if its Sorry, I guess my sleep schedule is really off right now. And yeah, you get the idea. If the idea is you could effectively do the scans from the planet. There's a good shot it's more cost effective using a ship though, so it is something that we'll have to get played around with. However, I've got to make a design decision on what actually is behind the harder to scan down signatures. One idea I had was certain signatures give you like an upfront value and then they're done. And then other signatures actually like give you a consistent bump. Or like they regenerate or something like that. So like, and I guess that makes sense. Like you essentially have like a large upfront amount of money, or like you either sometimes you can discover a large upfront amount of resource. Other times the idea would be that you can discover a resource that yields more over time. So maybe you get like 500 credit from a certain scan target, but then that's it. And then another scan target could give you like an extra 3 per tick, which over time adds up to like more than 500. And essentially the scanning would reveal stuff like that. You could find the burst economy in certain elements, and you could find the overtime stuff. So then it comes down to, the problem with that is that I don't know a way to do like unlimited scanning potential. Because right now I've got it set up where the scanning frequency can continue to increase. Which means that feasibly there would be no cap on scanning difficulty, but that just, or there would be no limit on how difficult the hardest scan could get. The idea would be that it would throughout the game continue to potentially throw tougher scans at the player. It's just weird if the player like spawns something that takes 100 frequency to start. That's gonna suck. So the idea is to instead spread easy and more difficult scanning instances around the system, and the player can pick and choose when they want to invest into a more thorough discovery of some potential celestial. And that would provide a finite range of difficulty, and then perhaps within that range of difficulty there could be tiers. So like maybe there's like maybe the smallest signature could have 3 different difficulties, and that like triples the difficulty or something like that for the third one. It's getting into a weird point where like scanning frequency being unlimited really it kind of screws things up, because I don't know how to balance, or I don't know how to I haven't designed something yet that could actually I just haven't designed something yet that could actually fit in with the vision of the game of having uncapped stuff. it's a very severe like content challenge, trying to come up with like extracurricular stuff for the player, because without the scanning system like this, you're basically just grabbing planets and maybe finding neighboring NPCs. But with the scanning system, there's more like there's a different depth to the game that the player can take advantage of. So I am wondering how to... I'm sorry that I'm just sitting here talking about this, but this is very, very integral with how I continue building the game, so I absolutely have to sit here and consider these things for the game. Because I don't want them to just be like little placeholder mechanics, I want them to actually be compelling. So it's going to take some time just to consider this. So like... some kind of system to like... Okay, so let's assume we minimize... If I minimize frequency requirement, or if I put a cap on required frequency, then I more or less would just have to cap the maximum frequency. And then, or more specifically, I suppose, I wouldn't have to cap the frequency, but I could... It would have to cap the... Like, there couldn't be... how could I make the game where the difficulty never stops increasing? Like, I would have to come up with some kind of... Yeah, I mean, it starts to get into logical issues because, like... You're just asking for the game to start needing like logical context. Like if they scan down some thing that's floating through space, is it like some ancient civilizations like a lost data cache or something like that? And the second it gets down that route, then it starts to kick into humanoid lore, and it's just not the route I'm trying to go down here. So the only thing that's really coming to mind as a feasible solution is capping the scan frequency. And then if I cap the scan frequency, I can cap the scan signature size to a minimum value. Or the scan challenge. I could just cap the scan challenge difficulty, more or less. Otherwise, it's a content... It just turns into a gigantic content consideration, having to, like, come up with some way to inputize that system. It's different than the other ones, I suppose. However, sometimes the signatures provide nifty ways for the player to like set up mining operations, or maybe set up transport operations, because maybe they discover a cache, like maybe there's like a floating asteroid cluster or something, or like there's just some kind of asteroid cluster in space, and like upon discovering it, the player can start sending ships there to bring the minerals back. But if it's, depending on how easy it is to scan, would assume that it has a large supply available. As long as the effort goes into retrieving the materials. Man, yeah, I don't know. Another thing I was considering was adding a compound system to this game where the player can basically find gases and metals or minerals or solids, more or less. And effectively, I could create some cheeky little Lorical chemistry materials that are combinable. And the idea would be that the player could utilize these base resources, but then also find creative ways to combine them together. So I'm trying to think of a particular example. I don't actually have a good particular example because I'm not too familiar with material science. But like, I know there's certain metals that are reinforced when they combine in certain ways, or like there are certain resources that do that. So that was one thing I was considering, was using a ship, or not a ship, but using a compound system, and that would give the player a lot more diversity with fewer base values. Because then you're looking at like it starts to beg a lot of lorical elements, though, unfortunately. So, like, I'm thinking, like, even if I did that, I would have to hand tune all of the combinations of the materials, and I would have to come up with. I'd have to, like, decide specific things that are buffed in certain ways. And, like, once again, though, it starts to become. It more or less just becomes. Like, it becomes a capped system. I suppose for now I could just cap the system. And that would give the player some diversity to start with for scanning. Without taking away some of the other elements of the game. It would be cool if I could pull off this uncapped system somehow. Otherwise I have to custom write the scan frequency value to be capped, which is going to beg for it to be way more expensive to invest into per level. I guess one thing I could do is make the scan frequency, or make each tier of the scan frequency require like a certain crystal type or something that would be required to fire off scans of that caliber. And through that, there would be a resource limitation on gaining new scan frequency levels. Is one way to balance that out. And each tier provides a remotely more rare resource, or requires a rarer resource, more or less. So it would be one of the only things that requires every resource at some point, whereas everything else to buff is like one resource. But kind of coming back to the compound system, because what could happen is you could have singular elements that accelerate each of these, but then you could have a compound that can accelerate like multiple values, but faster than a singular element. So it could expand the research capacity and the breadth of research, basically. But then that's kind of pushing towards like eventually having a super compound that buffs everything. So that's so maybe on that one. I also don't want resource overload for the player. However, resource overload, quote unquote, gives a much wider range of random materials. And in that event, there would be a lot more diversity throughout the space, especially if they're based on like a rarity system. But then if it's a rarity system, then there are certain research options that are just harder than others to buff. If they require, like if one of them just randomly requires the rarest resource, it's just gonna be harder to increase that value. Because that's the only idea I've really got right now for subspace signatures is like asteroid clusters and gas clouds. Maybe I could find like a plasma field or something. Yeah, I don't know. I'd have to like study space or something. Study things in space. The only other option would be relying on planets and moons to like have stuff you scan down, but then you're just like arbitrarily finding things on the planet. It doesn't yield to any mystery. You're just gonna find the stuff. But I don't have a way to. I don't have a good way to make like a bazillion different things every time. So if I kept it simple to like an economy game that was like an empirical economy game, more or less the signatures would just provide value. I still have the option in the research window to add a scroll bar, and then give the window the ability to be scrolled down, and then lower on the research window there could be like research projects that provide game mechanics, not just value shifting research. Excuse me. I'm doing my best though to not take away anything from the player from the get-go. The only thing I'm really arguing taking away at this point is the scanning frequency. Just because I'm not fathoming a good way to sort out that system, because the thing is, once a player ship gains a scanning capacity, the ship will in fact be able to fly to celestials and do scans right there. So they'll be able to do like really short, narrow scans up to the required frequencies. So there's no like, and maybe it's ship specific. So yeah, dang, this is gonna be, I'm gonna have to consider this. In the meantime, I suppose what I could do is just make a raw system to spawn things properly. And I got a couple ideas for how to make that work. One idea is to use like a Fibonacci sequence to spiral out from the sun. But make sure that each selection is like a proper radial value beyond the previous value. And effectively that will make sure that there's like no overlapping spawns. And from that system I could just more or less create the ability to spawn things more randomly without getting too specific on what I'm spawning. I could just spawn base celestials. Okay, so one thing I just kind of considered is like, how does the player know if they've scanned everything in the system? Their only real option is to do a gigantic AoE scan. Which is why I was coming up with another specific mechanic, which might be able to go under leadership from a discovery leader, but a discovery leader could essentially do something called like telemetry calculation. And the lore would be that the leader, based off of the calculations of other orbitals, could basically pinpoint a rough space, or could pinpoint a rough area where there's a celestial, based off of the gravitic interference. And that would give the player the ability to use that discovery leader to pinpoint things that are missing, if the player doesn't feel like scanning everything themselves. So that's, mechanically speaking, something I would like to do. Another part of this is that if the signature is big enough, it will come up on the screen just fine, so I can click on it. But the idea is that if there's some signature that's super tiny that I haven't discovered yet, like, there isn't going to be an object, there would have to be like a UI element. Or I suppose there could be a game, it could just be a game object. It could just be like a circle. Or it could be like a circle with a text percentage that signifies like 35%, and then I could click on that and it would bring up the info about it being a certain tier, unknown, needs more scanning, something, 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 something. And then upon that, a specific scan can be done to like do a little bit more work on that particular spot. And the idea is to add a hotkey arrangement where I can basically like click on this, and if I hold like Alt and click, or if I right click, it would effectively, more or less, quote unquote, auto lock the system. So it would do the most efficient scan. It would be exactly the correct range, and it would minimize the angle to 1 for the player automatically. And that effectively just makes the scan super cheap. It looks weird, but and that's a way the player can kind of it would just be an extra courtesy for the player to do it like that. Excuse me. Alright, so sorry that I haven't done any material work in this video, but I have to understand what I'm building first here. Some discovery in the game is probably not a bad idea. In Solaris, for instance, they have anomalies, and you can use a ship to go and research the anomaly. Give me 1 second. Somebody's knocking at my door. Alright, sorry about that. I'm back. Somebody was knocking at the door. Alright, so I've got to come up with some kind of system to decide what I'm going to be spawning here. So I'm going to grab the trusty notepad and see if I can devise something. Alright, the main issue here is the fact that I honestly just don't know how to do it infinitely rediscoverable system. to match the other uncapped styles within the game mechanics. It breaks down a lot of the other ways that this game can provide a lot of replayability. Within like randomly diverse ways. The discovery and not be Oracle. If I had access to a bunch of artists or something, I could like we could just come up with a bunch of shit to like for the player to discover, but that we don't have. I don't have that right now. So the ideas I'm trying to come up with are feasible for me to develop on my own, but still be interesting to some degree. Alright, so let's consider planet types for a second. Pretty standard agreement on types of planets. There's like continental planets, Earth-like planets. There's ocean planets, which is mostly water. Then you've got like lava planets, which are extremely magmous. And then there's desert planets, arid planets, Arctic planets. And I think there's technically one more, which is there's tundra, but these are like basically exactly what Stellaris uses. And I know I'm pretty sure it's what all the other games use too. This is just the kind of planets that exist in space. So we got these specific planets. One thing the player could do is the player would understand with time that the different benefits of these planets. So a planet could like continental planet, for instance, could be balanced, the most balanced of planets or something like that. The Arctic planet could be research, which is very similar to endless space. Lava planets make sense for some kind of industry bonus. Not even sure what a tundra planet would do specifically. Essentially, each of these types could also have a certain balance of the game resources by default. Which then gets into picking material types. Like actually naming materials. So I'm gonna have to do some design thinking to decide on something like this, but it is very important because the player will discover planets, and those planets are in fact claimable, and they do in fact have if they're a little different, that adds game diversity. And it also provides strategy in terms of like looking for certain types of planets. I can also spawn each of them with a separate color. As for some kind of okay, so for instance, maybe an Arctic planet has a low economy cap, but it has a very high research cap. And on the contrary, maybe like trying to pick one arbitrarily here, but perhaps for some reason a desert planet has really high scan range but like low research. Or maybe like a desert planet is harder to invade or something. And like a continental planet has a balanced maximal value. That would provide diversity to planets. So the bonus of having a certain type of planet is how it can maximize its infrastructure values. And that would provide some difference between the planets, because otherwise each planet can just be maximized, or perhaps each planet has different costs associated with the infrastructure, which is going to really jank up the system from the player's perspective, because the player was under the impression that players are under the impression that it's supposed to be pretty straightforward on the investments. Also, if their values get capped, then there's a good shot that I'm gonna have to bite the bullet and like make them cost a little more per value increase or something, which really limits the economy's potential. But that stops the player from doing that thing where they just perma upgrade the economy. Man, I was trying to avoid doing that though in this game. Like every other game does that. Every other game caps and makes things harder at higher levels to gain. Part of this game was that you should have more power, like the more you invest in stuff. You should have more ability to reinforce your position, not have this diminished effect from investment. Is really what I was trying to go for, but it's like I guess there's also gas giants also aren't there. So I'm looking at like if I include the tundra planet arbitrarily, then you're looking at what, 8 planets? But like tundra, arid, and desert. Like arid and desert are pretty close to a certain extent. And I don't have a good lorical. I don't really have a good lorical reasoning just quite yet for like what each planet should contain. Like, it's understandable the continental planet is like could have a little bit of everything. It can't compete with like lava for certain stuff, but it can outcompete lava in all the other stuff. The only other thing to do would be not cap anything at all, and every single planet can I suppose where there's a will, there's a way, so the idea would be that each planet would actually be able to invest as the player desires, but different planets would possibly add different costs for different tech, so that it's not just and actually gas giants could feasibly produce gas over minerals or something like that. There's also, I suppose it can be balanced by discovery. So maybe each of the planets have the same infrastructure potential, but they have different discoverable values. So like lava planets could have more, they're more likely to have like some kind of mineral deposit, whereas an ocean planet maybe it doesn't have a mineral deposit, but it does have like some kind of I'm honestly not sure what, but it could skewer more towards some kind of other element, and then like same thing for the other ones. It's gonna take some thinking, that's for sure. I was under the impression that it was just gonna be like you jump on a different type of planet and it's just going to make sense for the player to have diversity in the planet types. Every other game has that also. The other thing I wanted to do was add planet sizes. And the size of the planet, this is in other games, does help determine some maximal values for the planet. There are other games that have planet sizes, though. But it's feasible enough. Alright, I'm going to cut this video a couple minutes short. I think that there's some company showing up, so I'm going to cut it short for here. Sorry that all I did today was talk about design, but it's pivotal at this point, so I really appreciate it if you bothered to stick through that. I will see you in the next video. Take care.